He's one of the people who put FYE together, who thought about what it should look like, who shepherded from all the approval process, and
Can you hear me? Do I need to talk loud? This thing is as close as I can get it to me. Good? Okay. I'll use my teacher's voice. Kiara forgot to mention one important thing. I taught in FYE in its first year, and it was one of the most challenging, exciting, and enjoyable things that I've ever done here at San State. So yes, I'm an administrator now, but I just want you to know I do have some street cred as a faculty member. I taught in the School of Education for 18 years. And before that, in a previous life, I was a classroom teacher, grades 4 through 12 for 16 years. And then after that, I got my doctorate and came to the university to work with teachers. So I spend a lot of time thinking about classrooms, and I think about what goes on in the classroom, and I'm most interested in, as you'll see, in the experience of students in the K-12 classroom. So we'll talk about that more as we go along. How many of you, by the way, are undeclared, just so that I know? So a lot of you in here will probably recognize me if you came to orientation, because I was the person who presented to you about undeclared in most of the orientations in this room. So welcome back. Glad to see you again. Here's what I hope to cover today. We're going to start with Plato, and we're going to try to understand his vision of what a worthwhile educational experience might look like, and then I'm going to offer an alternative model. We're going to look at schooling in the United States today, and eventually we're going to get to the here and now. And this is my goal. I want to get to this question. What does Plato's Cave, how many of you read Plato's Cave? And how many of you understand Plato's Cave? That's pretty good. Okay, so it's to get to this question. What does Plato's Cave have to do with your identity as new students at Sonoma State? The first half of FYE is it's identity and global challenges. So the first half, we're looking at identity. So what we're going to think about today is the students' identities as learners. So as you probably know, Plato's Cave, I got this off the internet. It's a visual representation of his cave. You know that it's from the Republic, which is probably one of the most famous books that Plato ever wrote. He, as you all know, was a Greek philosopher a couple of thousand years ago, and he was probably the most important thinker of his time. So an allegory, this is an allegory of the cave. Remember, an allegory is a story that serves as a symbolic representation of some truth or generalization about human existence. So we need to understand how Plato's allegory works. And in order to do that, I want to show a short excerpt from a movie that most of you saw pretty recently. How many of you saw The Matrix? Okay. Well, you probably weren't thinking about Plato's Cave while you watched it. So this is what I want you to do. I'm going to show you a scene when, as you know, the main character, Neo, Keanu Reeves, has some suspicions that the world around him is not exactly what he thinks it is. So in this scene, it's where he meets Morpheus, his teacher, who shows him the truth, the way things really are. And I'd like you to think about Plato's Cave and think about the experience of the student, Neo, in this excerpt, in this show. So it's going to be just 10 minutes long.
Let me give you one piece of advice. Be honest. He knows more than you can imagine.
At last. Welcome you. As you no doubt have guessed, I am Morpheus. It's an honor to meet you. No. The honor is mine. Please, come, sit. can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to go wrong. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Do you believe in fate?
No,
Why not?
because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
I know exactly what you mean. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. But there's something wrong with you. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind. Try it. It is this feeling that is waiting to be. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Matrix.
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neil. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. Follow me. Take off. Be online. Almost. Time is always against us. Please, take a seat there.
You did all this.
The pill you took is part of a trace program. It's designed to disrupt your input-output carrier signal so we can pinpoint your location.
What does that mean?
It means buckle your seatbelt, Dorothy, because Kansas is going bye-bye.
so sure it was real?
What if you're not able to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
Yes, you can.
Be what? Be real.
It's going into rotation.
Hey, Bob, this is a little matter.
It's gone. It's gone.
Tank, we're going to need a signal soon.
That's in relation.
A5, location.
Target almost there.
It's going into arrest.
I got him.
Now, Tank, now.
Welcome to the real world.
Okay, that's perfect. Welcome to the real world. Grab the lights. Welcome to Sonoma State, the new real world. Okay, let's make some connections here. So then we've got Plato's cave again. In the cave, the learners in the cave are those prisoners shackled to the wall. They're clueless about what's real. They don't know what's real. They think that what they're looking at, that is what their senses tell them, is the real world. But what they see and what they hear is just shadows and echoes against the wall that are being created by people behind them. Nothing more. Our senses fool us rather than revealing the truth. What does Morpheus say? You are a slave, Neo, born into a prison for your mind. That's Plato's cave. Now the teacher's job then is to come down into the cave and to unshackle the prisoners and to turn them around, to turn the mind around, as Plato says, and show the prisoners that they've been fooled, show the learners that they've been fooled. Then the teacher takes the learners up to the light to show them the real sunlight as opposed to the flickering candle. How does Morpheus put it? You have to see it for yourself. This is a huge transformation, and it's not like, if you're thinking about school, it's not like when you figure out a difficult math problem and say, oh, I get it, now I know how to do it. It's much bigger than that. It's much deeper. It's when the knowledge that you gain completely rocks your whole way of thinking, changes your worldview, has you see everything in a new way. So a few things about Plato's vision that you need to keep in mind throughout this lecture. First of all, and I might add not just Plato's cave, but the matrix. It assumes that there is such a thing as truth. Not just information, but something much more profound than mere facts. And not just things that you see, but ideas that you understand. Truth is an understanding of the good. It's an understanding of what's real, of what's right and wrong, of how to live your life. It's not easy to ascertain it, but it's there, waiting to be discovered or to be pointed out by the teacher. Secondly, in Plato's cave and in the matrix, learning the truth, looking into the sunlight, taking the red pill, is painful. It doesn't magically tell you the truth. It allows the learner the opportunity just to open up the mind. He says that again, open your mind, right? Taking the red pill just makes it possible to open your mind to seek the truth. But as I said a second ago, it's painful, and it requires a lot of hard work. Plato reminds us in the allegory how much it would hurt your eyes if you've been in for a lifetime in the dark, and then you come out into the sunlight. Think about being in a movie theater and then coming out into the sunlight afterwards. And of course, those of you who know the Matrix know that this is just the beginning of Neo's suffering. It's going to continue as he learns and understands and manages to harness the truth. The other thing to keep in mind is that it's really not easy, right? And you don't necessarily know when you start the journey where it's going to take you. You decide to open up your mind and you seek a new truth, just as Cheryl Strait did, and who knows where it's going to take you. It's very, very uncomfortable. That's what happens when you sometimes decide to leave your narrow, comfortable world and see things in a completely new way. This is a quotation from Rumi, a 13th century Persian poet, who wrote that you must become ignorant of what you've been taught. You need to be instead bewildered. Think about bewildered. So Plato also did not expect every teacher's pupil to achieve this level of understanding. This is not like the law in this country, no child left behind. Quite the opposite. Plato viewed education as a process of weeding out the less capable students until you had, in fact, left most children behind, and you ended up teaching the best and the brightest. In his world, the best became the guardians and the philosophers, and the others served lower functions in society. Now, one more thing to understand about Plato's vision, and I've just created a little graphic. As the allegory implies, it's up to the teacher to show the students the truth. The teacher has the knowledge represented, well, it was blue. It's blue on my screen, but it's something else there. But the knowledge represented in blue, and the teacher shows it, illuminates it, or gives it to the student. The student is the one in yellow. And notice that there is an arrow going from the knowledge to the student. The student is essentially passive, takes the red pill. Obviously, the student, like Neo, has to want to learn the truth. But it's still up to the teacher to show it. And the result then is transformation, when the student's understanding of the truth now mirrors the teacher's. That's why transformation and knowledge are both the same color. Now, how did Plato envision the teacher showing the students the truth? It wasn't as simple as taking the red pill. It wasn't as simple as just getting the bonds that enslaved him released. The way in Plato's world, it was the teacher asking the students questions, not open-ended questions that have specific correct answers, but, not open-ended questions to which there are many answers, but specific questions to which there are specific answers that the teacher already knows, and that sort of leads the student through a logical argument to the truth. Do you know what that's called, this method of teaching, where the teacher asks questions, the student answers, and it leads to another question, and so on? What is that called? It's called the something method. Anyone?
Socratic.
The Socratic method, because Socrates, who of course is character in Plato's Republic, is teaching his students, asking his students questions and leading them to the truth. That's what the Republic is. It's an example of how a teacher slowly but surely leads the student orients the student to the light. So what I want to know is, what does that look like in the modern American classroom? Well, I mean, how many of you did Socratic method? Not very many. That's interesting. Usually a sizable number have done it. Well, I have a modest example here. It's a very short excerpt from another movie. You can tell me if you know this movie.
In 1930, the Republican controlled the House of Representatives in efforts to alleviate
Notice the questions.
of the anyone? Great Depression passed the the tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which raised or lowered, raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point, on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Thank you. You know what that's from? Yeah, I'm realizing that movie is so dated, you probably don't get the joke. Do you know what that squeaking noise is? Yeah, I mean, I realize they don't know from chalkboards, right? Yeah, it used to be chalk. You know, they used to have a whole course in teacher education about how to write on the blackboard using chalk without squeaking. That's a joke. They didn't really, but it did take a certain amount of skill. So anyway, in this case, the idea of asking questions and following it with student answers didn't work. And I think actually in a lot of American classrooms, the transmission method of instruction, where the teacher directly conveys the knowledge to the student, it really doesn't make a dent in the student. There's no transformation happening there. And in fact, you can see, those students don't really care. They're just sitting there doing what I call in my research, the glaze. I think that school learning occurs a lot more readily when the learners care about what they're being taught. The teacher can drag the students to the sunlight, but they have to be willing to open their eyes in order to see it. So how do you get the students to care about what they're learning? I'm going to give you another example, and this is, you've read Plato, who was the greatest philosopher of his time. Well, I'm going to show you a slide by somebody who is, I consider, the greatest 20th century philosopher of education. Some of you may be familiar with him. His name is Bill Watterson. If any of you read Calvin and Hobbes, there is somebody who really understands American education and the experience of the student. So in this slide, it actually begins with Calvin and Hobbes. It's not in a classroom, but imagine if it were. It starts with Calvin and Hobbes seeing a snake. And immediately they start asking questions. They ask things like, what does it eat? Why is it flicking his tongue out? And they don't know anything. They're just asking questions. And then the key, the most important box is the one in the middle on the right-hand side that even has a green border around it. And it's when Calvin stops and says, heck, we don't know anything about snakes. And then the rest of it, they spend talking about how they're going to learn, and eventually they read a book about it. Now imagine this a step further. Imagine it in a classroom. Imagine a teacher who's brought in a snake and all kinds of reptiles and lizards and stuff, and they're all over the room. I had a teacher who did this in elementary school, by the way. And plus the teacher has provided books and videos and computers, internet access, and all the teacher says to the students is, okay, students, you get to learn anything you want about reptiles. You choose something that you're really interested in, and then you're going to teach everybody else what you learned. So the kids, like Calvin and Hobbes, figure out what they're most interested in. They're interested in how snakes eat. Figure out what you want to learn, and then you do something. You make a video, or produce a website, or perform a play, or write a report, or build a museum. I've seen great museums in classrooms. And then everybody sees what everybody else has done. Now, there are a lot of terms that can be used in education to name this type of learning process. Constructivism is the one that we use in the School of Education most of all, because the learner constructs the knowledge, or maybe more than one learner constructs the knowledge together. But the term I'm going to use is from two theorists named Miller and Seller, who call it transaction, because they contrast transmission with transaction. Now notice the difference. Notice how this time with knowledge and student, the arrows are going in two directions. That is, the learning experience can begin with the teacher, or it can begin, as it did with Calvin and Hobbes, with the learner. Either way, the students are interested, they're engaged, and they want to learn, because when they learn, they're going to then turn around and contribute what they learn to the body of knowledge. Now the next step, the change in color, shows that as the process goes on, student and the knowledge are evolving together. They influence each other. Blue and yellow are coming together, and they're becoming green. The student uses the official knowledge out of books and off the web and so on, but uses that as only a jumping off point to construct new meanings and new ideas. Now sometimes this learning can result in transformation, and under a totally new understanding of the experience, of the phenomena that we're studying. Now, again, transformation is not just about learning new facts or bits of information. It's not just about, if Calvin and Hobbes taught about what snakes eat, it's not just about, here's the list of things that snakes eat. It's not just knowledge, it's understanding. So, say maybe Calvin and Hobbes, in the midst of all of their studies, found that, well, snakes eat, I don't know what they eat. They eat mice, and mice eat something else, and something else eats something else, and they get a sense of the food chain, and they understand all of a sudden that the ecosystem is this delicate thing that if the snakes are threatened, it could affect everything. That's transformation. That's big. That's far beyond the basic knowledge of what snakes eat. There was also a time, I asked my friend Jane McDonough if she wanted to come here. I don't know if she's here. But she was a teacher for many years, and in her class once, there was a transformation around a snake. She had a boa constrictor named Squeezer in her classroom, and one day, Squeezer bit one of the students. It's okay, it wasn't poisonous. You know, kids got a snake flailing around. And you can bet that that was also a transformational experience. Not quite what Jane expected. Oh, she is there. Not quite what Jane expected, but nonetheless, this student, I'm sure, who's now in her 40s, will never see snakes in the same way again. So that's important. I'll get to the messiness in a minute. So again, the key differences between transmission and transaction. In transmission, the knowledge is one way. It goes from the teacher or the book to the student. In transaction, it goes both ways. So what are the significant differences? Because there are a lot of implications here. First of all, the view of the nature of knowledge. Transmission assumes that knowledge is fixed and absolute. It exists apart from the learner. Like Plato's truth, it's out there in the sunlight. You find the truth in books, and you find it in the minds of those who already acquired it. The teacher has it, and the students don't. Transaction assumes that knowledge is not fixed. It's tentative. It's ever-changing. People construct, but then they might reconstruct the knowledge throughout their lives as their experience changes. So it depends on your experience. It depends on your culture. If you got bit by Squeezer, you're going to have a different view of snakes than somebody who didn't. And it's everywhere. The knowledge is not just in the books. It's in the snakes. It's in your own experience. It's not just in the teacher's head. I'm down, the colors just did not come out. I'm down to the third one, which was blue. In transmission views of education, the teaching event has to start with the teacher. But with transaction, it can start anywhere. Then on to the next one, which was green. In transmission views of education, the learner can be passive, taking in the elixir of knowledge and pour it into the head of the student. In transaction views of education, the learner has to be actively involved or it just doesn't happen. And finally, at the bottom, transmission is more efficient than transaction. The teacher simply gives the knowledge to the student, and that's it. Presumably, the student learns exactly what the teacher taught. Transaction, on the other hand, is inefficient. The knowledge constructed could differ significantly from what the teacher intended. It takes time for the knowledge to be constructed. But I want you to understand, and you're never finished with it. You think you're done, but then something new comes up. That's messy. But I want you to understand that messy versus efficient doesn't mean that one is bad and the other is good. It's, in fact, anybody who believes in a transactional view of knowledge will say that messy, since knowledge is messy, learning has to be messy as well. Okay, and then just to remind you again, both types of learning events can result in transformation when students see the world in new and different ways. Right now, I'm trying to transmit knowledge to you, and I'm hoping that it's going to transform your thinking. I'm hoping at the end of the day, you're going to start looking at your own education and see it in a whole new way. So that's what I'm hoping, but I think it's more difficult to pull it off doing what I'm doing than when you're just telling students new and exciting ideas, than having you involved in it. But in both cases, obviously the students have to care about what they're learning. But how do you get them to care? Am I getting you to care by talking to you, or if you get involved, are you going to care more? I maintain that the more you're involved in the construction of knowledge, like Calvin talks, the more likely that you will be actively and engaged, and that you will meet some of the main goals of education, which are, this, according to one educational theorist, James Banks, see, gaining knowledge is just the start. First you gotta care. He says to know, to care, to act. I would say to care, to know, to act. First you gotta care. Then you might know, and then of course, knowledge and caring should lead to action. That is, what do you do with that knowledge? What do you do in the community? What do you do for your family? What do you do for the world? That's ultimately what the goal of education should be. I know it's the goal of FYE. Okay, haven't gotten to the 21st century yet. Fast forward. In many ways, the conception of formal education is still very much based on Plato's vision. Plato, in his chapter 4 of The Republic, had young learners studying stories, poetry, music, all chosen by the philosophers. They were the teachers. And the idea was that those topics, those subjects, instilled the proper moral and social values. Older students then studied math and other subjects. This was the notion of a so-called liberal education, that by studying the great books in various subjects and engaging in deep philosophical discussions, the students would gradually be turned to the sunlight and brought up into the sunlight. Learning to actually do something was left to the lower classes in society. All that was needed for the philosopher kings was to be able to go on this intellectual journey and then learn the truth. This is where the notion of general education comes. GE, is that a familiar term for you? The idea that you need to be well-rounded intellectually to complete your education. Now, just as in Plato's time, your education, K-12, was broken into various categories or subjects to be taught. Here's a list of some that I was expected to learn, and you were too. That's the GE package too. Arts and humanities, science and technology, social sciences, and so on. That same idea really originated with Plato. So what the students are taught is called the curriculum. Here's the definition. It's a very basic definition of curriculum. There are many of them. And the idea that the basic subjects that you would learn as part of the curriculum. So this is basic Plato, but there are some profound differences between his vision of education and the reality of schooling in the 21st century. First of all, the Republic doesn't concern itself, as I said, with the education of all the children in Athens. The craftspeople, the workers, they were apprenticed as they had been done for centuries. Plus, Athens was a pretty small place compared to the United States. How many students did Socrates have at his feet? I don't know, 5, 6? So for Socrates, the idea of curriculum dissemination was pretty simple. It started with the philosopher who had the knowledge, and then it went directly to the student. Transmission. Well, today, in 2013, things have gotten a lot more complex. First of all, we're talking about a lot more students. Millions of students. I don't know how many teachers. Hundreds of thousands, millions of teachers. And as I already said, unlike in Plato's time, schools are expected to successfully transmit the knowledge to every single student. So dissemination of the curriculum, that is the knowledge that everybody is supposed to know, is a lot more involved. The ideas about what should be taught start high in the government, interestingly, not with philosophers, in fact, not even with educators at all. It starts with elected and appointed officials who develop curriculum guidelines, or standards as they're called, that reflect the values of society as a whole. These guidelines pass through a series of bureaucratic levels, becoming ever more specific until they reach who's at the bottom of the food chain. Anyone? Anyone? Who's at the bottom of the food chain? The students, right? The teachers and students are way at the very bottom, and the idea is that their educational experience is somehow supposed to reflect the ideas that came down from the top through direct transmission. And to make sure that this has happened, what happens? The students are given standardized tests that are evaluated somewhere near the top to find out if you learned what they wanted you to learn from the top. So what impact does this have on schools? I'm talking about the schools that we all attend. This is the kind of thing that I study, and in the time remaining, we can only touch on a few issues. The main thing to consider is what's required of any institution that has to process huge numbers of people in a short amount of time. So let me draw an analogy. Plato has his allegory of the cave. I have the analogy of the violin maker. Imagine a craftsperson who makes violins. Each one is made from start to finish. Each piece is carefully fitted together. Each is unique. Each violin takes a very long time to make, but in the end, each is beautiful, and it produces a superior tone. But what if you needed to mass produce violins, millions of violins? You would develop a method for mass production. Machines would make the backs and the fingerboard and the scroll, and parts would be fitted together as they come down the assembly line. You wouldn't have such a great product, but you would have a lot of them, and in the shortest possible time. It would be efficient. There's no room for messiness if you need to make a million violins. Do you see where I'm going with this? This was the challenge 100 years ago that educators faced in the beginning of the 20th century. Schools were growing. The immigrant population was booming, and the people in the country were moving into the cities to work in the factories. For educators, the question was, first of all, how can we keep the kids off the street and make sure that they all learn to read and write, and especially learn American values? So what was the answer? The answer was the assembly line. With the amazing success of the Industrial Revolution, the solution was obvious. Model the schools on factories. Not so well. Model the schools on factories. This was cutting edge in the 1920s. This was new thinking. The student entering into kindergarten is the raw material. Then the student completing school at the end is the finished product. There's even a little what do you call those, the mortarboard on the top. All you needed to do was figure out what the end product needed to know, divide that knowledge into its constituent parts, and move the student along the assembly line. That's where the idea of switching classes came from. Plato's students didn't switch classes. That's where the idea of switching classes came from. That's where the idea of bells came from. It was all part of this homage to the Industrial Revolution in the 1920s, and it's still the way things are today. In fact, they even built schools, not that many in this part of the country, but back east, almost every school built between 1920 and 1940 was built to look like a factory, an homage to the Industrial Revolution. So today, schools combine Plato's idea of a liberal education with this industrial model, but I don't think Plato would approve of the way it has evolved. Gone is the search for truth and beauty and transformation. You really need, when you think about education, you need to erase this vision of a handful of students discussing philosophy at the feet of their mentors. Give up the notion of transformative experiences. The number of students to be pushed through the system necessitates an emphasis on basic skills and facts that can be taught efficiently. Quality control is assured through machine scored, filling the bubble, standardized tests. Here's an interesting picture. This is actually a special test called the Math Olympiad. And my nephew actually was one of the people in here. And what's amazing to me is that this looks almost exactly like this photo from 1851 of a fountain pen factory. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. It's buzzing. I forgot to turn it off. So what's been the impact of this factory model on us, the products of the system? 13 years in school teaches us a lot more than the formal curriculum of reading, writing, and arithmetic. There's something that educational theorists call the hidden curriculum that can have a much greater impact than the formal curriculum on the students. The atmosphere of the school and the way we're treated teaches us a lot about ourselves and teaches a lot about ourselves and our relationship to the knowledge that we're being taught. Let's take my own schooling as an example. My mother saves everything. And so a few years ago, she gave me my, you know what that is?
Report card.
It's a report card. It's my kindergarten report card. Report cards are very useful artifacts for determining what a school system values. You get graded on what matters, right? And I'm realizing you can't read that, can you? Can you see it? Yes. There are the social attitudes and there's individual development. It's interesting because what's not there? There's nothing academic there. It's, and I want you to know, those of you who can read it, that S was as good as you could get. So I got mostly S's, except I got an E and keeps hands to himself. Nobody's perfect. But I got better. I got an S after, right? Now, so you've got things like works in place with the group, follows directions, helps keep room in order, shares equipment, finishes work he has begun, and so on. Courteous, keeps hands to himself, and so on. So what did I learn in kindergarten then about what I needed to know to be successful in school? I learned to be quiet unless spoken to. I learned to sit still until I was released. I learned to do what I was told, line up, follow directions. Everything has a place, you know, in the cubbies and in the cloakroom and so on. Raise your hand to go to the bathroom and so on. Basically, what was the hidden curriculum there? Conform. Do what you're told. Stay invisible. Don't make waves. Do what you're told and shut up. Nobody actually said to me, John, your ideas and feelings don't matter nearly as much as moving along that assembly line. But that's what I learned. That's what I learned. In fact, I was in my late teens before I found out that cooperate means to work together with somebody. Like cooperation means that two or more people are doing things together. I thought cooperate meant be quiet because they kept saying to me, John, you're not cooperating. Start cooperating. I got this now. So anyway, a recent kindergarten report card shows that the situation hasn't changed a lot. It's only become more intense. This could be from your era. This is in the 90s. I think the student now is probably in his or her early 20s, right? The social skills are still there. They're in the upper left-hand corner. But now, specific skills in reading and writing and math have been added. Each of these categories represents a standard that came down from the state government and must be met. What it takes to read and write and do math has been broken down into tiny steps along that learning assembly line. You've got all these steps for reading and language arts. I don't know if you can read this, but I can tell you that it doesn't have transformation listed there. In fact, I can't imagine how it could happen when you've got to get through all of this stuff. But again, the hidden curriculum is teaching students to be passive, to conform. There's one that I love in here. It says, enjoys being in school. It's like, that's one of the rules. You will enjoy being in school, or else. Knowledge originates with the teacher, not with the student. And in fact, all the things I was talking about transformation, you don't want that. Transformation can be undesirable. It causes discontent. It causes stress. It causes change. It's bewildering. There's no room for bewildering in the efficient function of an institution. Now, just so that I don't want high schools to be left out, does any of you know what this is? Come on, somebody here must have gotten one of these. Aha, okay, it's a referral notice. Not mine, I want to say, but something near and dear to my heart. It's okay, he turned out all right. And yes, my son got a referral for insubordination minor. I think it's number 20 was checked off on a list of, 50, and then it says horseplay at lunch, and then down at the bottom it checks off what intervention was made, which was talking to or something. And so that's how you keep kids in line. Now, I don't want to blame the teachers. I'm not blaming the teachers, and I'm not blaming the administrators or the students. It's the hidden curriculum that we all learn really comes from the institution itself. Think about the enormity of the tasks that schools face. I love going on to high school campuses, and you know when I like to go? I like to go at lunchtime. Because at lunchtime, everybody's out, and the kids really are themselves. You know, they're hanging out in groups, and they're punching each other, and you know, they're smoking by the tree, and I don't really like that part. And they're flirting and making out, and all of this stuff going on. And then what happens? The bell rings. And what happens after the bell rings? It's like a science fiction movie. In 3 minutes, 2,000 students have disappeared. They've all gone somewhere, like machines, to where they need to go. And I'm standing there all by myself. That is an amazing thing to consider. Now, of course, what would happen if the students could do whatever they wanted? You'd have chaos. If you're going to have huge schools, you've got to condition everyone to move when they need to move and go where they need to go. Think about what it took to train everyone, though, to get to that point. That training began in kindergartens like yours and mine. And the conformity is not just in terms of behavior, it's academic as well. You have all of these things that you have to do in order to get into college. You have to meet all of the requirements, A through G, and if the high schools don't do it, you won't get into college. So back to my favorite philosopher, Bill Watterson, he looks at what is the experience of the student. The experience of the student is all kinds of things. He has turned into a zombie or a parrot or a prisoner. Basically, you see Calvin suffering through school all day long. So is that what it's like for you? Yes? Oh, we'll put you on the couch. No, I mean, it was that way for a lot of us. But then for a lot of you, you're probably thinking, this isn't me. This isn't me. I enjoyed school. I personally loved school. I might also add that today when I go into schools, I see teachers everywhere who, in spite of standardization of curriculum and seeing 150 students a day, they close their doors and they foster a learning environment that's educational. And you're also probably thinking, well, what does this have to do with me? I'm in college now. I've passed through this. Well, the fact is that the human curriculum has had a greater impact on us than we realize. Sitting here in this room, we're not just the survivors, we mastered the system. We all learned to negotiate it and to flourish within it. Now, you may think that it's done, but it's not done. You're still in the system. Do you know what this is? This is the GE pattern, right? You still have to follow directions, and you still have to take certain courses and deal with scheduling and MySSU and all of that stuff, to the extent that seeking transformation may be still terribly, terribly elusive. So the question is, how do we get back to the main purpose of education? In the remaining 2 minutes, I'm going to give you what I think is a solution. Because it's easy to forget. We want to remember to be bewildered and to shake our foundations and our worldview and challenge ourselves to consider new ways of thinking. We want to remember how to know, to care, and to act. Well, I think Plato got it right in his allegory of the cave that education should be transformational. But he left something out. In order to be transformational, you need to be involved in your education. Now, I think a lot of you, like Neo, have already sort of taken the red pill and leaped down the rabbit hole, and now you're feeling bewildered, as Rumi described it, as you negotiate these new worlds. Others of you may not be interested in this, but I'm hoping that most of you will be, that you would like to take this leap into the unknown. And here are a few ways that you could do it. All of these are about taking the red pill. First of all, find something you're passionate learning about and pursue it. One way to do this might be to open up your mind about topics addressed this coming year in FYE 150. You're going to hear from scholars from across the curriculum. They're all wanting to share their intellectual passions. If a lecture by a particular professor fascinates you, talk to him or her. I hope you'll come and talk to me if you're interested in some of these ideas. And find out what courses you might take from that professor. Like Calvin, ask questions if you don't understand. Secondly, seek professors who will challenge you to construct new meanings with the knowledge that they share. How many of you use ratemyprofessor.com? Good, it's a great website, but don't use it to find the easiest profs. Use it to find the ones who are going to inspire you. Use it to find the ones who are going to be like Morpheus, who are going to work you like Morpheus worked Neo, so that you can become the one, perhaps. Thirdly, find like-minded students to accompany you on your intellectual journey. You've already done that. You're here in FYE. There are other students who are interested in potentially taking the red pill. Fourth, push yourself in search of transformational experiences, even when the challenges you face are insurmountable. Do you know who that is? That's Cheryl Strayed. There aren't a lot of photos of her on the web, but this was her with Monster on her back. Right? You got to push yourself. It ain't easy, but you've got to be willing to take those risks. And the last one I want to add a shameless plug for my own profession. Consider becoming a teacher. We need more Morpheuses out there who are going to challenge the system and their students to help transform their understanding of the world around them. So, and one more thing, don't blow it, right? Because this is your one opportunity in college. But the last thing is, that's all I've got to say except this. In my hand, I have a red pill and a blue one. I hope as you begin your college education that you will all take the red pill. Have a great day.